easy matter after all. However, when our turn came, the little man was much more favourable to me than to any of the others, and he closed the door as we entered so that he might have a private word with us. "This is Mr. Jabez Wilson," said my assistant, "and he is willing to fill a vacancy in the League."
"And he is admirably suited for it,"
the other answered.
"He has every requirement. I cannot recall when I have seen anything so fine."
He took a step backward, cocked his head on one side, and gazed at my hair until I felt quite bashful. Then suddenly he plunged forward, wrung my hand, and congratulated me warmly on my success.
"It would be injustice to hesitate,"
said he.
"You will, however, I'm sure, excuse me for taking an obvious precaution."
With that, he seized my hair in both his hands and tugged until I yelled with the pain.
"There is water in your eyes,"
said he as he released me.
"I perceive that all is as it should be. But we have to be careful, for we have twice been deceived by wigs and once by paint. I could tell you tales of cobbler's wax which would disgust you with human nature."
He stepped over to the window and shouted through it at the top of his voice that the vacancy was filled. A groan of disappointment came up from below, and the folk all trooped away in different directions until there was not a red head to be seen except my own and that of the manager.
Of course, let's pause for a moment now. Put this at level 1. A very strange story that's being told. Notice only broken one time for Holmes to make one comment about it. So basically, this man says, "I'm a pawnbroker, I'm a widower, I've got this guy named Spaulding who's my helper guy. He takes lots of pictures and he goes into the basement of my pawn shop where he develops them. And he brought to me this newspaper that said, if you have fiery red hair, you might be able to get paid whole bunches of money for basically doing nothing, simply because you have red hair. Some American who had red hair, who died and left money." And so I went with Spaulding. We went through this interview, and as soon as I walked in, he was like, "You're the guy." And then he reached up and he grabbed my hair and he yanked on it to make sure that I wasn't wearing a wig. Let's pause. Doyle, obviously, through the story that Wilson is telling, is already making you wonder what is going on here, right? This is a very strange kind of story. Now, within the confines of Doyle's stories about Sherlock Holmes, readers always know there's something going on, lurking, we might say, in the shadows of a story like this that are going to ultimately lead to an interesting kind of adventure story. Doyle's stories about Sherlock Holmes, by the way, were always adventure stories. There's going to be an adventure that stands behind this. Right now, though, as readers, we find ourselves trying to make predictions already. Like, what is going on? What kind of weird story? All right, let's get on now to the end of the story that Wilson will tell, all right?
"My name," said he, "is Mr. Duncan Ross, and I am myself one of the pensioners upon the fund left by a noble benefactor. Are you a married man, Mr. Wilson? Have you a family?"
I answered that I had not. His face fell immediately.
"Dear me,"
he said gravely.
"that is very serious indeed. I'm sorry to hear you say that. The fund was, of course, for the propagation and spread of the redheads as well as for their maintenance. It is exceedingly unfortunate that you should be a bachelor."
My face lengthened at this, Mr. Holmes, for I thought that I was not to have the vacancy after all. But after thinking it over for a few minutes, he said that it would be all right.
1174.
"In the case of another," said he, "the objection might be fatal, but we must stretch a point in favour of a man with such a head of hair as yours. When shall you be able to enter upon your new duties?"
"Well, it is a little awkward, for I have a business already," said I.
"Oh, never mind about that, Mr. Wilson," said Vincent Spaulding. "I should be able to look after that for you."
"What would be the hours?" I asked.
10 to 2.
Now, a pawnbroker's business is mostly done of an evening, Mr. Holmes, especially Thursday and Friday evening, which is just before payday. So it would suit me very well to earn a little in the mornings. Besides, I knew that my assistant was a good man and that he would see to anything that turned up. "Well, that would suit me very well," said I. "And the pay?"
is £4 a week.
And the work?
Is purely nominal.
What do you call purely nominal?
Well, you have to be in the office, or at least in the building, the whole time. If you leave, you forfeit your whole position forever. The will is very clear upon that point. You don't comply with the conditions if you budge from the office during that time.
It's only 4 hours a day, and I should not think of leaving, said I.
No excuse will avail,
said Mr. Duncan Ross.
Neither sickness, nor business, nor anything else. There you must stay, or you lose your billet.
And the work?
Is to copy out the Encyclopedia Britannica. There is the first volume of it in that press. You must find your own ink, pens, and blotting paper, but we provide this table and chair. Will you be ready tomorrow?
Certainly, I answered.
Then goodbye, Mr. Jabez Wilson, and let me congratulate you once more on the important position which you have been fortunate enough to gain.
He bowed me out of the room, and I went home with my assistant, hardly knowing what to say or do. I was so pleased at my own good fortune.
All right, let's pause. Level 1, write it down. What are the rules? Rule number 1, you have to have red hair. Rule number 2, well, we're going to pay you, but you have to come to this room, right, from 10 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon every day, and you have to sit at this table, and you have to copy out the encyclopedia. That's it. That is it. And we're going to pay you a substantial amount of money. By the way, notice back 2 pages, if you'll just turn really quickly. You probably saw this as we were reading, but notice that we've got some information that your textbook company will provide to you on 1170. Math connection, pound conversions. The advertisement that concerns Mr. Wilson announces a salary of £4 a week. The pound is the monetary unit of Great Britain. Its equivalency in American dollars fluctuates depending on current economic conditions. At the time Doyle wrote the story, 1 British pound equaled about $4.85 US. So £4 would have equaled about close to $20. This was considered a large amount at the time in which the story is set, right? Particularly for easy work, like just sitting and copying out. So this is our story, and he says, I was very excited about the possibility that I was going to get paid to sit in a room and do absolutely nothing. Of course, the problem is he's going to have to leave his business, but that's okay. His helper Spaulding says, I will take care of it. And the fact that most of the real work of the pawnbroker shop happens in the evening, he said it was perfect, and so I was ready to go as early as the next day. All right? Well, obviously something has transpired since that moment, which is why he's standing there with Holmes and Watson. Now we're going to get on to the rest of the story.
Well, I thought over the matter all day, and by evening, I was in low spirits again, for I had quite persuaded myself that the whole affair must be some great hoax or fraud.
Right.
Though what its object might be, I could not imagine. It seemed altogether past belief that anyone could make such a will, or that they would pay such a sum for doing anything so simple as copying out the Encyclopedia Britannica. Vincent Spaulding did what he could to cheer me up, but by bedtime I had reasoned myself out of the whole thing. However, in the morning I determined to have a look at it anyhow, so I bought a penny bottle of ink, and with a quill pen and 7 sheets of foolscap paper, I started off for Pope's Court. Well, to my surprise and delight, everything was as right as possible. The table was set out ready for me, and Mr. Duncan Ross was there to see that I got fairly to work. He started me off upon the letter A, and then he left me, but he would drop in from time to time to see that all was right with me. At 2 o'clock he bade me good day, complimented me upon the amount I had written, and locked the door of the office after me. This went on day after day, Mr. Holmes, and on Saturday the manager came in and planked down 4 golden sovereigns for my week's work. It was the same the next week, and the same the week after. Every morning I was there at 10, and every afternoon I left at 2. By degrees, Mr. Duncan Ross took to coming in only once of a morning, and then after a time he did not come in at all. Still, of course, I never dared to leave the room for an instant, for I was not sure when he might come. and the billet was such a good one and suited me so well that I would not risk the loss of it. 8 weeks passed away like this, and I had written about abbots and archery and armour and architecture and Attica, and hoped with diligence that I might get onto the bees before very long. It cost me something in foolscap, and I had pretty nearly filled a shelf with my writings. And then, suddenly, the whole business came to an end.
To an end?
Yes, sir. And no later than this morning. I went to my work as usual.
1176.
But the door was shut and locked, with a little square of cardboard hammered onto the middle of the panel with a tack. Here it is, and you can read it for yourself. He held up a piece of white cardboard about the size of a sheet of notepaper. It read in this fashion: "The Red-Headed League is dissolved, October 9th, 1890. Sherlock Holmes and I surveyed this curt announcement and the rueful face behind it until the comical side of the affair so completely overtopped every other consideration that we both burst out into a roar of laughter.
"I cannot say that there is anything very funny," cried our client, flushing up to the roots of his flaming head. "If you could do nothing better than laugh at me, I can go elsewhere."
"No, no," cried Holmes, shoving him back into the chair from which he had half risen.
"I really wouldn't miss your case for the world. It is most refreshingly unusual. But there is, if you will excuse my saying so, something just a little funny about it. Pray, what steps did you take when you found the card upon the door?"
I was staggered, sir. I did not know what to do. Well, then I called at the offices round, but none of them seemed to know anything about it. Finally, I went to the landlord, who was an accountant living on the ground floor, and I asked him if he could tell me what had become of the Red-Headed League. He said that he'd never heard of any such body. Then I asked him who Mr. Duncan Ross was. He answered that the name was new to him. "Well," said I, "the gentleman at number 4. "What, the red-headed man?" "Yes."
"Oh," said he. "His name was William Morris. He was a solicitor and was using my room as a temporary convenience until his new premises were ready. He moved out yesterday."
"Where could I find him?"
"Oh, at his new offices. He did tell me the address. Yes, 17 King Edward Street, near St. Paul's."
Well, I started off, Mr. Holmes, but when I got to that address, it was a manufactory of artificial kneecaps, and no one in it had ever heard of either Mr. William Morris or Mr. Duncan Ross.
"And what did you do then?"
asked Holmes. "I went home to Saxe-Coburg Square, and I took the advice of my assistant, but he could not help me in any way. He could only say that if
1177.
I should hear by post, but that was not quite good enough, Mr. Holmes. I did not wish to lose such a place without a struggle, so as I had heard that you were good enough to give advice to poor folk who were in need of it, I came right away to you."
"And you did very wisely," said Holmes. "Your case is an exceedingly remarkable one, and I shall be happy to look into it. From what you have told me, I think that it is possible that graver issues hang from it than might at first sight appear."
"Grave enough," said Mr. Jabez Wilson. "Why, I've lost £4 a week."
"As far as you are personally concerned," remarked Holmes, "I do not see that you have any grievance against this extraordinary league. On the contrary, you are, as I understand it, richer by some £30, to say nothing of the minute knowledge which you have gained on every subject which comes under the letter A. You have lost nothing by them."
"No, sir, but I want to find out about them, and who they are, and what their object was in playing this prank, if it was a prank, upon me. It was a pretty expensive joke for them, for it cost them £32.
"We shall endeavour to clear up these points for you. And first, 1 or 2 questions, Mr. Wilson. This assistant of yours who first called your attention to the advertisement, how long had he been with you?"
"About a month, then."
"How did he come?"
"In answer to an advertisement."
"Was he the only applicant?"
"No, I had a dozen."
"Why did you pick him?"
"Because he was handy, and would come cheap."
"At half wages, in fact?"
"Yes."
What is he like, this Vincent Spaulding?
1178.
Small, stout built, very quick in his ways. No hair on his face, though he's not short of 30. Has a white splash of acid upon his forehead. Holmes sat up in his chair in considerable excitement.
I thought as much, said he. Have you ever observed that his ears are pierced for earrings?
Well, yes, sir. He told me that a gypsy had done it for him when he was a lad. Said Holmes, sinking back in deep thought.
He is still with you?
Oh, yes, sir. I've only just left him.
And has your business been attended to in your absence?
Nothing to complain of, sir. There's never very much to do of a morning.
That will do, Mr. Wilson. I shall be happy to give you an opinion upon the subject in the course of a day or two. Today is Saturday, and I hope that by Monday we may come to a conclusion.
All right, let's pause for a moment, jot it down at level 1. So you now have the full story. He shows up. The only rules, as we said, was that he has to come during that time. He can't leave the room, and he's copying out of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And then one morning, 8 weeks in, he comes, and the sign is on the door that says, the Red-Headed League has been dissolved. No more Red-Headed League. It's like, what is going on? He tries to run it down. He can't figure it out. So he ends up at Holmes's room to ask for some help. Notice Holmes asked a couple of questions about Spaulding, the helper, right? And then when he heard about the earring holes in the ears, right, the piercings, then all of a sudden Holmes was ready to say, I'm very interested in your case. Jot down at 2B already, antagonist, protagonist, protagonist, antagonist. What for you are already identifiable, maybe possibilities for the protagonist in our story and for the antagonist in our story, and maybe we would ask why, all right? Now, as in all Doyle stories about Sherlock Holmes, you kind of always have a 3-part movement. Part 1 is almost always like this. By the way, one of the reasons that I'm hoping that you'll enjoy reading this is that you'll go and pick up other stories of Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle and begin to read them. They're all wonderful stories. Some of you have maybe seen film versions of Sherlock Holmes and know there's all kinds of really great stories that are often associated with Doyle's telling about this famous investigator. But they always seem to fall into 3 parts. And if you'll think about it, even in a film that maybe you've seen of Sherlock Holmes, they follow a very similar pattern, which was, of course, for Doyle's readers, predictable and yet fun to read. The first part is always the introduction, where something bizarre, kind of surreal or strange happens. Then, of course, the second part of the story will be the investigation. And then finally, at the end of the story, there will be some kind of revealing or revelation, right? That is to say, the problem is solved, the crime is solved, however we want to think about that. All right, so here we go. We'll now come back to the second part of the story, all right?
Well, Watson, said Holmes, when our visitor had left us, what do you make of it all? I make nothing of it, I answered frankly. It is a most mysterious business.
As a rule, said Holmes, the more bizarre a thing is, the less mysterious it proves to be. It is your commonplace, featureless crimes which are really puzzling, just as a commonplace face is the most difficult to identify. But I must be prompt over this matter.
What are you going to do then? I asked.
To smoke, he answered. It is quite a 3-part problem, and I beg that you won't speak to me for 50 minutes.
He curled himself up in his chair with his thin knees drawn up to his hawk-like nose, and there he sat with his eyes closed and his black clay pipe thrusting out like the bill of some strange bird. I had come to the conclusion that he had dropped to sleep, and indeed was nodding myself, when he suddenly sprang out of his chair with the gesture of a man who had made up his mind, and put his pipe down upon the mantelpiece.
Sarasate plays at the St. James's Hall this afternoon, he remarked. What do you think, Watson? Could your patient spare you for a few hours?
I've nothing to do today. My practice is never very absorbing.
Then put on your hat and come. I'm going through the city first, and we can have some lunch on the way. I observed that there is a good deal of German music on the program, which is rather more to my taste than Italian or French. It is introspective, and I want to introspect. Come along.
We
1179.
travelled by the underground as far as Aldersgate, and a short walk took us to Saxe Coburg Square, the scene of the singular story which we had listened to in the morning. It was a poky little shabby genteel place, where 4 lines of dingy 2-storied brick houses looked out into a small railed-in enclosure, where a lawn of weedy grass and a few clumps of faded laurel bushes made a hard fight against a smoke-laden and uncongenial atmosphere. 3 gilt balls and a brown board with Jabez Wilson in white letters upon a corner house announced the place where our red-headed client carried on his business. Sherlock Holmes stopped in front of it with his head on one side and looked it all over, with his eyes shining brightly between puckered lids. Then he walked slowly up the street and then down again to the corner, still looking keenly at the houses. Finally, he returned to the pawnbroker's, and having thumped vigorously upon the pavement with his stick 2 or 3 times, he went up to the door and knocked. It was instantly opened by a bright-looking, clean-shaven young fellow who asked him to step in.
Thank you, said Holmes. I only wish to ask you how you would go from here to the Strand.
3rd right, 4th left, answered the assistant promptly, closing the door. Smart fellow, that, observed Holmes as we walked away. He is, in my judgment, the 4th smartest man in London, and for daring, I am not sure that he has not a claim to be 3rd. I have known something of him before. Evidently, said I. Mr. Wilson's assistant counts for a good deal in this mystery of the Red-Headed League. I am sure that you inquired your way merely in order that you might see him. Not him. What then? The knees of his trousers. And what did you see? What I expected to see. Why did you beat the pavement? My dear